Jungkook rejected all proposals, until Jimin uttered a single phrase that changed their destiny. "I can't marry anyone, because my heart already belongs to someone who will never choose me." The confession exploded through the silent banquet hall like thunder, instantly freezing every conversation, every smile, every carefully rehearsed celebration. Hundreds of elegant guests stared toward Jungkook as the velvet proposal box slowly slipped from his trembling fingers and struck the polished marble floor with a sharp metallic sound that echoed beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. The woman standing before him remained speechless, her hopeful expression collapsing into disbelief while photographers lowered their cameras, uncertain whether they were witnessing a celebration or a tragedy unfolding in real time. Jungkook's chest rose and fell unevenly as he struggled to breathe beneath the weight of years of carefully buried emotions. He had rejected countless proposals, countless expectations, countless perfectly planned futures, yet none of those refusals had ever demanded the truth until tonight. His eyes wandered across the crowded ballroom, searching desperately for the one face he both feared and longed to find. Near the enormous glass windows overlooking the rain-soaked city stood Jimin, perfectly still, his black suit immaculate, his expression unreadable despite the storm raging inside his eyes. The distance between them was only a few dozen steps, yet it felt like years of silence stretched endlessly across polished marble. Everyone believed Jimin had simply attended as a close friend, another familiar face supporting Jungkook's important evening. No one knew that every heartbeat Jungkook had hidden for nearly a decade had quietly carried Jimin's name. Long before the invitations, before the luxurious ballroom, before the endless expectations placed upon him, Jungkook had convinced himself that loving Jimin meant accepting a future built entirely on silence. He had become an expert at smiling while swallowing disappointment, laughing while hiding jealousy, celebrating moments that secretly broke him apart. Jimin had unknowingly become both the safest place Jungkook had ever known and the greatest source of fear he carried every single day. Across the ballroom, Jimin slowly lifted his gaze until their eyes finally met. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The orchestra had stopped playing. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Even the rain striking the tall windows seemed strangely distant. Jungkook remembered countless nights sitting beside Jimin after exhausting rehearsals, sharing instant noodles in empty practice rooms while discussing dreams they believed would never change. He remembered Jimin's strange habit of tapping his fingers against coffee cups whenever he was nervous, pretending everything was fine while quietly worrying about everyone except himself. He remembered the countless times Jimin had encouraged him before difficult performances, always offering confidence to others while refusing to admit his own fears. Those memories refused to disappear, no matter how desperately Jungkook had tried to move forward. They had become part of who he was. Meanwhile, Jimin stood motionless, but inside his mind an entirely different battle raged. For years he had convinced himself that protecting Jungkook meant stepping farther away whenever emotions became too obvious. Every time Jungkook smiled at someone else, Jimin silently reminded himself that happiness sometimes meant letting another person choose a different road. Yet hearing Jungkook's confession moments ago shattered every carefully constructed wall around his heart. The words echoed endlessly inside him. "My heart already belongs to someone." Jimin feared asking the question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. What if that someone had always been him? Around them, anxious guests slowly began leaving the center of the ballroom, instinctively creating space neither man had requested. The woman whose proposal had been rejected quietly closed the velvet box herself, offering Jungkook a sad but understanding smile before disappearing into the crowd without anger, as though she had realized that competing against a heart carrying years of unfinished feelings had never truly been possible. Jungkook barely noticed. Every instinct urged him toward Jimin, yet fear anchored his feet to the floor. He had imagined this moment countless times, but imagination had never prepared him for reality. His greatest fear had never been rejection. It had always been losing the friendship that had quietly become the foundation of his entire life. Then, without warning, Jimin began walking toward him. One slow step, then another. Each footstep echoed through the silent ballroom with impossible clarity. Jungkook felt his pulse hammering against his ribs as memories collided with hope, regret, and uncertainty. When Jimin finally stopped only inches away, neither of them spoke immediately. They simply looked at each other, seeing years of hidden conversations reflected in tired eyes that no longer wished to pretend. The rain outside intensified, streaking silver across the towering windows, while distant lightning illuminated the city beyond. Jimin's voice finally emerged, soft enough that only Jungkook could truly hear it. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jungkook lowered his eyes, unable to hide the tears gathering despite every attempt to remain composed. Because I was terrified that loving you would cost me the one person I couldn't live without. Silence followed, not empty, but painfully full of everything neither of them had ever dared to say. For the first time in years, neither man searched for the perfect words. They simply stood together as the world around them slowly disappeared, leaving only two hearts carrying the weight of years that neither time nor distance had managed to erase. Jungkook expected Jimin to step back, to smile sadly, or to quietly end the conversation before either of them crossed a line they could never erase. But instead Jimin reached forward and gently took the trembling velvet ring box from Jungkook's hand, as though it carried years of unspoken pain instead of polished silver. Neither of them noticed the last guests quietly leaving the ballroom, giving them a privacy no one had planned but everyone instinctively respected. The silence surrounding them felt strangely warm, interrupted only by the distant rhythm of rain striking the enormous windows. Jimin studied the unopened ring for a long moment before letting out a slow breath that sounded heavier than words themselves. Do you know what frightened me the most all these years? He asked without lifting his eyes. Jungkook could only shake his head. It wasn't losing you. It was watching you become someone who smiled while hiding everything. Sentence struck deeper than any accusation ever could. Jungkook's shoulders slowly fell as though he had been carrying invisible armor for far too long. He remembered every interview where he forced laughter despite exhaustion, every celebration where he congratulated others while quietly burying his own feelings, every late-night drive through empty streets after dropping Jimin home, wishing the journey would never end because saying goodbye always hurt more than he admitted. Jimin had noticed all of it. Every carefully hidden crack, every exhausted smile, every moment Jungkook believed no one was paying attention. Jimin slowly looked up, his eyes glistening beneath the ballroom lights. You always thought you were protecting me, he whispered, but every time you pretended your heart was somewhere else, I wondered whether I had imagined everything between us. Jungkook stared at him, unable to breathe. Countless forgotten memories suddenly rearranged themselves inside his mind. The lingering glances during rehearsals, the quiet concern whenever one of them skipped meals, the habit Jimin had of saving Jungkook's favorite dessert without ever mentioning it, the nights they sat on rooftops watching sunrise after endless work, neither wanting to be the first to leave because the silence between them somehow felt safer than the noise of the world below. None of those moments had been accidents. None of them had existed only inside Jungkook's imagination. A faint smile touched Jimin's lips, bittersweet and fragile. I kept waiting for you to choose your own happiness, he admitted. Every proposal you rejected made me wonder if you were still searching for someone impossible. Jungkook slowly closed the distance between them until only a single breath separated their faces. His voice trembled with complete honesty. I wasn't searching. He swallowed hard before continuing. I was waiting for the courage to stop running from the truth. Jimin lowered his gaze, fighting emotions he had hidden for nearly as long. He had spent years believing that timing mattered more than feelings. He believed that careers, responsibilities, and expectations demanded sacrifices too painful to question. Every decision had been made to protect what they already had, never realizing that silence itself had slowly become the greatest threat to their bond. Outside, the rain finally began to soften. Storm that had swallowed the city moments earlier faded into a quiet drizzle, leaving tiny droplets sliding peacefully across the glass like tears finally finding rest. Jungkook noticed Jimin absent-mindedly tapping his fingertips against the ring box exactly the way he always tapped coffee cups whenever anxiety overwhelmed him. The familiar habit made Jungkook smile through watery eyes. You still do that, he said softly. Jimin looked down, slightly embarrassed before laughing under his breath. Some habits never disappear. I'm glad they don't, Jungkook answered. The words carried no hesitation this time. They felt lighter than anything he had spoken in years. Jimin carefully placed the unopened ring box back into Jungkook's palm before gently closing Jungkook's fingers around it. Don't use this because everyone expects a perfect ending, he said. Use it only when your heart no longer carries fear. Jungkook nodded slowly, understanding that this moment was never about jewelry, ceremonies, or promises made in front of strangers. It was about finally allowing themselves to become honest after years of protecting everyone except each other. They walked together toward the towering windows overlooking the sleeping city. Reflected in the glass, they no longer looked like two people separated by silence, but like two souls who had survived years of misunderstanding without ever truly letting go. Neither of them knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. There would still be difficult conversations, expectations, and choices waiting beyond the ballroom doors. Yet for the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something they had to face alone. Standing side by side beneath the fading lights, Jungkook quietly realized that destiny had never changed in a single dramatic moment. It had changed little by little through every unnoticed act of kindness, every sacrifice left unnamed, every goodbye that secretly wished to become a stay, until all those invisible moments finally led them to the truth they had both carried from the very beginning. Morning sunlight slowly replaced the night's relentless rain, casting long golden reflections across the quiet streets outside the hotel. The city was waking as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but for Jungkook, every familiar sound felt different. The distant traffic, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, and the soft breeze slipping through the half-open balcony doors all reminded him that life had continued moving while his heart had remained trapped in yesterday's silence. He stood alone in his suite, still wearing the white dress shirt from the previous evening, its sleeves rolled carelessly to his elbows. Sleep had never come. Instead, he had spent the entire night replaying every word Jimin had spoken, every expression that had crossed his face, every moment they had nearly lost because neither of them had found the courage to speak first. On the small table beside the window rested the velvet ring box. It remained unopened. Jungkook looked at it for several long seconds before gently picking it up. For years he had believed the ring represented commitment, but now it meant something entirely different. It represented honesty, something far more difficult than making promises. His phone vibrated softly. The screen displayed a single message from Jimin. Breakfast, same place as always. Jungkook smiled without realizing it. There were no dramatic declarations, no lengthy explanations, only a sentence that carried years of shared memories. The same place was a tiny cafe hidden between two old brick buildings, a place they had visited countless mornings after exhausting rehearsals. No reporters ever searched for celebrities there. No one interrupted them. It was simply a quiet corner where they could become ordinary people for a little while. Less than 30 minutes later, Jungkook pushed open the cafe door. A small brass bell chimed overhead. Warm air carrying the scent of butter, cinnamon, and freshly baked bread wrapped around him instantly. Nothing inside had changed. The faded wooden tables, the handwritten menu hanging slightly crooked behind the counter, and the old jazz music floating gently through hidden speakers all remained exactly as he remembered. At the table beside the window sat Jimin, already stirring a cup of coffee with slow, absent-minded movements. He looked up the moment Jungkook entered, offering the same gentle smile that had always made difficult days seem lighter. "You're late," Jimin teased quietly. Jungkook laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. "By 3 minutes. Still late. You're impossible. You knew that years ago." Their conversation flowed naturally, almost surprisingly so. The awkwardness Jungkook had expected never arrived. Instead, it felt as though years of hidden emotions had quietly removed an invisible wall standing between them. They spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, music they had recently discovered, a restaurant they had promised to visit but never found time for. Yet beneath every simple sentence lived an entirely new understanding. Neither of them needed to pretend anymore. After breakfast arrived, silence settled comfortably between them. Jimin watched the steam rise from his coffee before speaking again. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Jungkook nodded immediately. "You spilled hot chocolate on your jacket." Jimin groaned dramatically. "I was hoping you'd forgotten that." "Never," you laughed for almost 10 minutes. "Because you blamed the chair instead of admitting it was your fault." Jimin couldn't help laughing too. The sound filled the little cafe with unexpected warmth. For a few precious moments they were no longer carrying years of regret, they were simply themselves. Then Jimin's expression slowly became thoughtful. "I've been thinking all night." Jungkook looked at him carefully. "About us," Jimin nodded. "About everything we sacrificed because we thought silence was safer than truth." He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger before continuing. "Maybe we spent too much time protecting each other from pain that only existed in our imagination." Jungkook considered those words carefully. He remembered every opportunity he had allowed to disappear because fear always sounded more convincing than hope. He remembered convincing himself that one honest conversation could destroy everything, never realizing that avoiding the conversation had nearly done exactly that. "I don't want to hide anymore," Jungkook admitted softly. Jimin met his eyes without hesitation. "Neither do I." Outside the cafe, people hurried along the sidewalks, umbrellas tucked beneath their arms after the storm. Life continued at its usual pace, completely unaware that inside the small corner cafe, two lives had quietly begun changing forever. Jungkook reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed the unopened velvet ring box on the table between them. Jimin looked at it but made no move to touch it. Still unopened, he observed. Jungkook nodded. Because you were right, he smiled gently. It shouldn't begin with fear. For a moment, neither of them reached for the box. Neither of them needed to. What mattered was no longer hidden inside it. What mattered was sitting across the table, smiling with tired eyes that finally carried hope instead of uncertainty. As morning sunlight poured through the cafe window, bathing the table in soft golden light, Jungkook quietly realized that destiny had never been waiting at the end of a perfect proposal. It had been waiting in every ordinary morning they almost missed, every shared laugh they nearly forgot, and every simple conversation they had finally found the courage to have together. The morning drifted into early afternoon almost unnoticed, as Jungkook and Jimin remained seated by the cafe window, watching strangers come and go while quietly rediscovering a version of themselves that had been buried beneath years of expectations. The world outside moved with its usual urgency, but inside the little cafe time slowed into something gentle, allowing every glance and every smile to linger a little longer. Jungkook had forgotten how peaceful silence could feel when it no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. He looked at Jimin across the table and realized that the nervous habit of tapping his fingers had disappeared. Instead, Jimin rested both hands around his warm coffee cup, as though he no longer needed small distractions to hide his thoughts. "You're smiling again," Jimin said with a quiet laugh. Jungkook blinked in surprise. "Was I?" Jimin nodded, without forcing it. The observation settled deeply inside Jungkook. For so many years he had smiled because cameras expected it, because interviews demanded it, because fans deserved happiness even when his own heart felt uncertain. This smile was different. It arrived naturally, without effort, and that frightened him almost as much as it comforted him. "I forgot what that felt like," he admitted. Jimin lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking. "I missed it." Those 3 words carried more emotion than pages of explanation ever could. Jungkook remembered countless evenings when Jimin would quietly study his face after long rehearsals, asking whether he was tired even before Jungkook himself realized how exhausted he had become. Back then he always answered with the same rehearsed phrase, "I'm fine." Now he understood how transparent that lie had always been. They eventually left the cafe together, choosing to walk instead of calling a car. The streets were still damp from the previous night's rain, and tiny pools of water reflected patches of bright blue sky between the passing clouds. The fresh scent of wet pavement mixed with blooming flowers from nearby balconies, creating an atmosphere that felt strangely familiar, as though the city itself had decided to breathe again after holding its breath for years. They walked side by side without rushing. Sometimes their shoulders brushed gently against each other before separating again. Neither of them apologized anymore. Neither of them stepped away. It felt natural, comfortable, honest. As they crossed a small bridge overlooking a quiet river, Jimin suddenly stopped walking. Leaning lightly against the railing, he stared at the calm water flowing beneath them. Jungkook noticed the thoughtful expression returning to his face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Jimin smiled faintly without taking his eyes off the river. "Do you remember the first promise we ever made?" Jungkook frowned slightly before his expression slowly brightened. "To never let success change who we were." Jimin nodded. "I think we kept half of that promise." Jungkook looked at him curiously. "Half, success didn't change us," Jimin sighed quietly. "Fear did." The words lingered in the cool afternoon air. Jungkook could not deny them. Fear had quietly entered their lives without either of them noticing. It had disguised itself as responsibility, maturity, and sacrifice until it became impossible to separate caution from loneliness. They had convinced themselves that silence was kindness when, in reality, it had slowly built invisible walls between 2 hearts that had always wanted the same thing. Jungkook rested both hands on the bridge railing beside Jimin. The gentle breeze lifted a few loose strands of Jimin's hair, and for a brief second Jungkook saw the young man he had first met years ago. The same bright eyes, the same quiet warmth, the same determination hidden beneath kindness. Time had changed many things, but not that. "Can I ask you something?" Jungkook said. Jimin turned toward him. "Anything." Jungkook hesitated only for a heartbeat. "If I had told you how I felt years ago, would anything have been different?" Jimin smiled, though there was sadness hidden within it. "Maybe." He looked back toward the river before continuing. "Or maybe we still needed to grow into the people capable of hearing those words." Jungkook considered that answer carefully. Perhaps love alone had never been enough. Perhaps timing was not about fate, but about becoming emotionally brave enough to accept happiness without running from it. They resumed walking, eventually arriving at a quiet park where children laughed beneath tall trees while elderly couples fed birds beside a small fountain. The ordinary beauty of the afternoon reminded Jungkook how much life existed beyond stages, schedules, and expectations. He had spent so long chasing tomorrow that he had almost forgotten how meaningful a single peaceful afternoon could become. Jimin sat on an empty bench beneath a large maple tree, closing his eyes as sunlight filtered through the leaves above them. Jungkook joined him without speaking. For several minutes neither of them said anything at all. They simply listened to the breeze rustling through branches and the distant laughter echoing across the park. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Jungkook reached out. His hand rested lightly beside Jimin's on the wooden bench. Their fingers remained separated by only a few centimeters. Jimin noticed the gesture immediately. Slowly, without looking away from the trees above them, he moved his hand just enough for their little fingers to touch. Neither of them made a grand declaration. Neither of them searched for dramatic words. That tiny contact carried years of patience, forgiveness, and understanding. Jungkook closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle into his heart. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like an endless road filled with impossible choices. It felt like a journey that could finally be shared, one ordinary day, one honest conversation, and one gentle smile at a time. The afternoon sun slowly descended behind the skyline, painting the clouds in soft shades of amber and gold, as Jungkook and Jimin remained in the quiet park long after most visitors had gone home. The laughter of children gradually faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds preparing for evening. Neither of them felt the need to hurry. For the first time in years, there was nowhere else they would rather be. Jungkook leaned back against the wooden bench, letting out a slow breath he never realized he had been holding. It felt as though every secret he had carried had finally left his chest, making room for something lighter, something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Jimin turned his head toward him, studying his face with quiet curiosity. "You're thinking too much again," he said with a gentle smile. Jungkook laughed softly. "You still know me better than anyone." "I always did." The answer came so naturally that neither of them questioned it. Their friendship had never been built on grand gestures. It had grown through countless ordinary moments, shared meals after exhausting schedules, silent car rides through sleeping cities, conversations that stretched until sunrise, and the quiet certainty that one could always find the other when life became overwhelming. Those moments had shaped them more deeply than either had understood. Jungkook looked toward the fountain in front of them, watching the sunlight shimmer across the moving water. "Do you ever regret anything?" he asked after a long silence. Jimin considered the question carefully. "I regret believing that pretending was the same as protecting." His voice remained calm, but the honesty behind it reached straight into Jungkook's heart. "I kept telling myself that if I stayed quiet, you would have an easier life. I never stopped to ask whether silence was making your life harder instead." Jungkook slowly nodded. "I did the same thing." They exchanged small smiles, realizing how similar their fears had always been. Different choices had led them to the very same loneliness. Neither had wanted to become the reason the other suffered, yet both had unknowingly created years of unnecessary distance. The irony made them smile even as it saddened them. As evening approached, they left the park and wandered through familiar streets lined with small bookstores, flower shops, and family-owned restaurants. Every corner awakened another memory. There was the tiny convenience store where Jimin once insisted on buying ice cream in the middle of winter, simply because Jungkook had looked unusually stressed. There was the old music shop, where they had spent nearly an hour arguing over which vinyl record sounded warmer. There was the quiet intersection where they had once stood beneath a single umbrella during an unexpected storm, laughing as passing cars splashed water onto the sidewalk. None of those memories had seemed important at the time. Looking back now, they realized those ordinary days had quietly become the happiest chapters of their lives. They eventually reached a small hill overlooking the city. The first lights had begun appearing in apartment windows below, transforming the skyline into a sea of tiny stars. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of pine trees from the nearby hillside, and the fading sunlight wrapped everything in a peaceful glow. Jungkook rested his elbows on the observation railing. "I used to come here alone," he admitted. Jimin looked at him with surprise. "Really?" Jungkook nodded. "Whenever everything became too loud." He smiled faintly. "I would imagine you standing here beside me complaining about the wind messing up your hair." Jimin burst into laughter. "I would absolutely complain." "I know." They both laughed until the quiet hill echoed gently with the sound. It was a simple moment, but it felt more valuable than any celebration either of them had attended. When the laughter finally settled, Jimin became unusually thoughtful. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges softened with age. I almost threw this away 100 times, he said. Jungkook accepted it carefully. The paper had clearly been folded and unfolded countless times over the years. Slowly opening it, Jungkook discovered a handwritten list in Jimin's familiar handwriting. At the top of the page were 4 simple words: things we should do. Beneath the title were ordinary dreams they had once spoken about during sleepless nights. Watch the sunrise from the beach without worrying about tomorrow, take a road trip with no destination, learn to cook one perfect meal together, visit a quiet mountain village during winter, spend an entire day without checking a phone, laugh until our stomachs hurt, stay honest even when honesty feels frightening. Jungkook's eyes lingered on the final sentence. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained perfectly clear. He looked up, unable to hide the emotion in his expression. You kept this all these years, Jimin smiled shyly. I wasn't ready to let those dreams disappear. Jungkook carefully folded the paper again before slipping it into his own jacket pocket. Then let's stop calling them dreams. Jimin tilted his head. What should we call them? Jungkook smiled, his eyes reflecting the countless lights scattered across the city below. Our future. Jimin looked at him for several quiet seconds before smiling in return, a smile brighter than any city light stretching across the evening horizon. In that peaceful silence, surrounded by the familiar skyline that had witnessed so many years of uncertainty, both of them understood something they had overlooked for far too long. Destiny had never been hidden inside extraordinary moments. It had quietly lived inside every promise they had postponed, every memory they had treasured, and every ordinary day they had chosen to spend beside one another without realizing they were already building the life they had always wished for. Night settled gently over the city, wrapping every rooftop and quiet street in a blanket of shimmering lights. Jungkook and Jimin remained on the hill long after the last streaks of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. The air had turned cooler, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain-soaked earth, but neither of them seemed to notice. They had spent so many years avoiding conversations like this that every passing minute now felt precious, as if time itself had decided to give them another chance. Jungkook slipped both hands into the pockets of his coat, his fingertips brushing against the folded paper Jimin had given him earlier. He smiled to himself. It amazed him that something so simple, a list of forgotten dreams scribbled on an ordinary sheet of paper, could hold more meaning than every expensive gift he had ever received. You never crossed anything off the list, Jungkook said quietly. Jimin laughed under his breath. How could I? Most of those things weren't meant to be done alone. The answer lingered between them. For years, Jungkook had imagined that happiness would arrive with a perfect achievement, another successful performance, another impossible goal accomplished. Yet standing beside Jimin beneath the stars, he finally understood that happiness had never been waiting at the finish line. It had always been hidden inside the moments he shared with someone who made ordinary days unforgettable. They slowly began walking back toward the city. The streets were calmer now. Store owners were closing their shops, cafe lights glowed warmly behind fogged windows, and soft music drifted into the evening from open doorways. The city felt almost dreamlike, peaceful in a way neither of them had experienced for a long time. As they passed a small flower shop preparing to close, an elderly woman stepped outside carrying several bouquets. Oh dear, she sighed with a gentle smile, these lilies won't last until tomorrow. She looked at Jungkook and Jimin before extending one bouquet toward them. Would you two help me by taking these? Jungkook instinctively reached for his wallet. Please let me pay. The woman shook her head. No, she smiled warmly. Some flowers are happier when they're gifts. For a brief moment, the three of them stood beneath the shop's warm yellow lights. The woman looked at them with kind eyes that seemed to understand far more than either man had explained. Take care of each other, she said softly. It's rare to meet someone who feels like home. Those words stayed with them long after they thanked her and continued walking. Jimin glanced down at the bouquet in Jungkook's hands. I don't think she realized who we were. I'm glad. So am I. Without cameras, interviews, or expectations surrounding them, they felt wonderfully anonymous. Just two people walking through the city, beneath a sky filled with stars. They eventually reached the riverside promenade. The water reflected thousands of tiny lights, each ripple transforming the skyline into moving fragments of gold and silver. A cool breeze swept across the river, causing Jimin to wrap his coat a little tighter. Jungkook noticed immediately. "You've always underestimated how cold it gets near the water." Jimin smiled. "And you've always noticed." "I always will." The simplicity of those words surprised even Jungkook himself. Years ago, he would have buried them beneath jokes or changed the subject before his feelings became obvious. Tonight he simply allowed them to exist. Jimin leaned against the railing, watching the reflections dance across the current. "Can I tell you a secret?" "You already know you can't." Jimin remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "Every birthday, every New Year's Eve, every wish I ever made." He laughed quietly, almost embarrassed. "It was the same." Jungkook looked at him. "What did you wish for?" Jimin slowly turned, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "I wished that one day we would stop pretending." Jungkook felt his heart tighten. All those years, while he believed he had been carrying his feelings alone, Jimin had been making the very same silent wish. Jungkook looked down at the bouquet of white lilies resting in his hands. He carefully removed a single flower and offered it to Jimin. "It's not much." Jimin accepted it gently. "It's everything." Neither of them spoke after that. They simply stood side by side, listening to the quiet river flowing beneath the bridge. The silence between them no longer felt unfinished. It felt complete. After a while, they continued walking until they reached a quiet residential street lined with old trees. At the end of the road stood the apartment building where Jimin lived. They stopped near the entrance. For years, this had been the place where they always said goodnight. A quick smile. A casual wave. "See you tomorrow." Nothing more. Tonight felt different. Neither of them wanted to repeat the old routine. Jimin looked up at the apartment windows before turning back toward Jungkook. "You know." He smiled softly. "I used to stand at my window after you left." Jungkook blinked. "You did?" Jimin nodded. "I waited until your car disappeared around the corner." Jungkook laughed in disbelief. "I thought I was the only one." "What do you mean?" "I never drove away immediately." Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck, slightly embarrassed. "I always sat there for a few minutes, just making sure you got inside safely." Jimin stared at him before quietly shaking his head with an affectionate smile. "We're unbelievables. We really are." They both laughed, the sound echoing softly through the peaceful neighborhood. Then everything became quiet again. Jungkook looked at Jimin, no longer seeing the uncertainty that had haunted both of them for years. Instead, he saw trust, comfort, and a future that no longer felt impossible. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the list of dreams once more. Carefully, he borrowed a pen from Jimin and drew a neat line through the final sentence. "Stay honest even when honesty feels frightening." Jimin watched him curiously. "You crossed it out." Jungkook smiled as he folded the paper again and returned it to his pocket. "Because starting tonight." He looked directly into Jimin's eyes. "It's no longer a dream." For the first time in their lives, neither of them felt as though destiny was something waiting somewhere ahead. It had quietly arrived the moment they finally chose truth over fear, allowing two hearts that had spent years walking beside each other to finally move forward, without hiding who they had always been. Several months passed, and life gradually settled into a rhythm that neither Jungkook nor Jimin had ever imagined possible. The city continued to race forward with its endless schedules, bright lights and crowded streets, yet the quiet moments they once considered impossible slowly became part of their everyday lives. They no longer measured happiness through grand achievements or unforgettable headlines. Instead, they found it in simple mornings shared over breakfast, evening walks without a destination, and conversations that no longer ended with unspoken words. The old folded list remained safely tucked inside Jungkook's wallet. Every now and then he would take it out, smiling as another dream quietly became a memory. They watched the sunrise together on a quiet beach exactly as they had once promised. They took a spontaneous road trip, getting lost more than once and laughing every time the navigation failed. They spent an entire afternoon learning to cook together, filling the kitchen with smoke after accidentally burning their first attempt before proudly enjoying the second. They even managed to spend a whole day without checking their phones, discovering that time moved much more gently when they gave it entirely to each other. One crisp autumn afternoon, they returned to the small hill overlooking the city where they had first begun believing that a different future was possible. The trees had turned shades of gold and crimson, and cool wind carried fallen leaves across the quiet path. Below them, the city sparkled beneath the setting sun just as it had months before, but this time neither of them looked at it with uncertainty. They looked at it with gratitude. Jimin rested both hands on the wooden railing, smiling as he watched the skyline. "It feels smaller now," he said. Jungkook looked at him curiously. "The city." Jimin nodded. "Not because it changed." He turned toward Jungkook. "Because my world doesn't feel so lonely anymore." Jungkook smiled softly. "I used to think destiny was something we had to chase. And now, I think destiny was quietly waiting for us to become honest." Jimin laughed gently. "I like that answer." The evening breeze lifted a few loose strands of Jimin's hair, and Jungkook instinctively reached over to brush them back into place. It was such a small gesture, one that once would have remained hidden behind hesitation. Now it happened naturally, without fear, without doubt. Jungkook reached into his coat and carefully removed the familiar velvet ring box. Jimin looked at it, then back at Jungkook, a smile already beginning to form. "You finally opened it." "I did." Jungkook slowly opened the box. Inside rested the same simple ring that had once represented pressure, expectation, and uncertainty. Now it represented something entirely different. Choice, trust, a future built on truth. Jungkook looked into Jimin's eyes. "I spent years believing I needed the perfect moment." He smiled. "But every perfect moment I ever searched for was already standing beside me." Jimin's eyes shimmered with emotion. Before Jungkook could continue, Jimin gently interrupted him with the same quiet confidence that had changed everything months earlier. "You don't have to convince me anymore." He stepped closer. "You already chose me the day you stopped hiding." Jungkook laughed softly through tears. "And you chose me." Jimin nodded without hesitation. "I think I always did." There were no cheering crowds. No flashing cameras. No grand stage. Only two hearts standing beneath an open sky, surrounded by the quiet rustle of autumn leaves and the warm glow of the setting sun. Jungkook slipped the ring onto Jimin's finger with hands that no longer trembled. Not because he was fearless, but because he had finally learned that courage was never the absence of fear, it was choosing love despite it. Jimin gently intertwined their fingers, looking toward the city one final time before smiling back at Jungkook. "We still have one dream left." Jungkook frowned playfully. "We finished the list." Jimin shook his head. "No." He lifted their joined hands. "We haven't finished writing the next one." Jungkook smiled brighter than he had in years. "Then let's write it together." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, they walked down the hill side by side, leaving behind the place where fear had finally given way to hope. They no longer searched for destiny because they understood its greatest secret. Destiny had never been hidden inside extraordinary miracles or perfect timing. It had always lived inside every act of patience, every quiet sacrifice, every ordinary day shared with the right person, and in the simple courage to speak the one sentence that changed everything forever.